History is full of dangerous jobs, but a few were so lethal, so absurd, and so brutally unfair that occupational hazard doesn't even begin to cover it. These were jobs where the people doing them often understood very clearly that death was not some distant possibility, death was part of the contract, sometimes literally. And the craziest part is that people still lined up to do them. Some wanted money, some wanted glory, some were desperate, and some were trapped. And some were just living in a world where power could always find a use for one more expendable human body. So today, we're looking at 5 of history's most deadliest jobs. Jobs where the survival rates sound fake. Jobs where the official explanation was usually some version of, "this is fine," while the reality was blood, plague, mud radiation, and total madness. Let's start in ancient Rome. Number 5, Gladiator. The popular image of Roman gladiators is totally wrong. People imagine them as shredded action heroes with perfect abs, but in reality, many of them were intentionally fattened up. That was the point. Archaeological evidence suggests gladiators ate a heavy diet of barley and beans that built a layer of fat over the body. Why? Because it made wounds look better. A cut could spray blood dramatically for the crowd without immediately hitting a vital organ. These men were, in a very real sense, being padded for entertainment. They were not just fighters, they were a product, a spectacle, a walking investment that needed to survive just long enough to be entertaining again next week. And yes, some fights ended with mercy. Not every match was automatically fatal, but the odds were still horrifying. In the first century, about 1 in 10 fights ended in death. Later, that got worse. By the 3rd century, around half of fights were fatal. First-time fighters had about a 1 in 3 chance of dying in their debut. The average career lasted only a few years, average age at death, 27. That is not a career. That is a countdown, and everything around gladiators was deranged. Romans drank gladiator blood as medicine. People believed it could cure epilepsy. Brides had their hair parted with swords dipped in gladiator blood for good luck. Fans scratched love notes about famous fighters into walls like they were celebrities or athletes. One gladiator, Flamma, was offered freedom 4 separate times and refused it every single time, choosing to stay in the arena until the day he died at 30. Then there was Emperor Commodus, a man so ridiculous he almost feels made up. He staged hundreds of rigged arena appearances, charged the state enormous sums for the privilege of watching him pretend to be a hero, and once terrified senators so badly that they bit down on laurel leaves to stop themselves from laughing at him getting killed. And even death didn't end the humiliation. Some gladiator corpses were stabbed with hot irons to make sure they weren't faking. Others were struck with a mallet after death as part of the arena ritual. So yes, survival was technically possible, but when your job involves being deliberately fattened up so your sword wounds look more entertaining to the crowd, that's a pretty good sign you picked the wrong profession. Number 4, Plague Doctor. The Plague Doctor outfit is one of the most famous creepy images in history. Black coat, bird mask, long beak, cane. It looks like something invented by a horror movie costume department. And somehow, the truth is even worse. For one thing, the iconic beak Plague Doctor wasn't even from the Black Death itself. That outfit appeared later, and many of the people wearing it were not elite medical experts bravely standing between civilization and collapse. A lot of them were basically whoever was still around. Because when plague hit, real doctors often fled, cities got desperate, so they hired whoever they could find. Barber surgeons, apothecaries, second-rate practitioners, and in one documented case, an ex-fruit seller. Imagine your city is collapsing, bodies are piling up, and the emergency medical response is apparently just some guy who used to sell pears. But to be fair to the fruit seller, nobody else wanted the job. One good thing about being a plague doctor is that you were actually paid well because everybody understood the risk. You were being hired to walk directly into a city everyone else was trying to escape. Your patients were infectious, your tools were primitive, your understanding of disease was basically wrong, and your treatment plan often sounded like it had been designed by a demon. They cut open swollen lymph nodes, they smeared wounds with substances that included tree resin and human waste, they used mercury. They attached live chickens and dried toads to swollen lymph nodes. Some remedies involved human blood, ground skull, or magic words written on paper. At one point, abracadabra was part of the medical toolkit. And the mask itself, it was based on the idea that disease traveled through bad smells. So the beak was stuffed with flowers, herbs, spices, and scented material to help filter out the foul smell. Completely wrong theory, but here's the dark joke. Parts of the outfit accidentally did help. The sealed wax coat may have reduced contact with plague-carrying fleas, so plague doctors were in a way sometimes protected by being wrong and the correct direction. The cane was also nightmare fuel. It was used to poke patients, lift clothing, keep distance, and sometimes even strike people who asked for penance. And then there's Nostradamus. Before the prophecies, he worked around plague. Unlike many others, he reportedly pushed fresh air, clean water, sanitation, and corpse removal instead of the usual medical nonsense, which makes him one of the few men in this entire category who seems to have been trying to solve the actual problem instead of summoning a medieval chemistry curse. Still, even when a plague doctor knew more than average, the job remained simple at its core. Walk into a city full of death where the rich are fleeing, the poor are trapped, medicine barely functions, and everyone is looking at you like you're either their last hope or the next corpse. That is not a real job. That is volunteering to stand in the blast radius of history. Number 3, World War I Trench Runner. Now imagine a battlefield where phones barely work, radios are clumsy and insecure, artillery cuts communication lines constantly, and a single message can decide whether an entire position lives or dies. Now imagine the solution is, send a guy. That was the trench runner. In World War I, trenches zigzagged so much that a runner might have to travel about a mile just to move a message 300 feet in a straight line. Shellfire shredded telephone lines, pigeons got shot, wireless sets were limited, so when commanders needed information moved fast, they used human beings. Human beings with legs and terrible odds, runners were supposed to memorize their message in case the written version was destroyed. They worked in pairs. They crossed trenches, open ground, shell holes, mud, and sniper lanes carrying information that could save dozens or hundreds of men. And everybody knew what that job meant. One officer summed it up perfectly. With a runner, it was really just a question of how long he lasted before being wounded or killed. That is one of the bleakest job descriptions ever written. The personal stories are brutal. Private James Miller was shot through the back the moment he left the trench. He still pressed his wound shut with one hand, delivered the message, took the reply, staggered back, and collapsed dead at the officer's feet. He was 26. At Maricourt in 1918, 5 runners in a row were killed trying to reach trapped men before one finally got through. 5 in a row. That's not bad luck. That's a system burning through human beings until one survives long enough to deliver the paper. And the environment itself was monstrous. Rats everywhere, corpses buried into trench walls, mud deep enough to drown in. At Passchendaele, some men disappeared into water-filled shell craters and were simply gone. Shell shock wrecked mines by the hundreds of thousands. This was not just combat, it was industrialized misery. Even one of the most infamous men in modern history, Adolf Hitler, spent much of the war as a regimental runner. It was dangerous enough that the role helped shape the mythology he later built around himself. And if all of that wasn't enough, even the backup system was insane. Carrier pigeons sometimes did the same work, flying through gunfire with messages strapped to their bodies. One of them, being Shirami, was shot through the breast and nearly lost a leg but still completed the mission. Which says a lot about trench runners, because in World War I, being the guy was somehow considered only slightly more disposable than being a bird. Number 2, Chernobyl Liquidator. In 1986, reactor number 4 at Chernobyl exploded. And once that happened, the Soviet Union needed human beings to do jobs that were so dangerous that even the machines started failing. That is not an exaggeration. The radiation around the exposed reactor was so intense that some dosimeters maxed out uselessly at low readings, making the disaster look survivable on paper, while men on the ground were literally kicking radioactive graphite with their boots. The reactor was open and the fire had burned for days. Firefighters arrived not fully understanding what they were standing next to, and many absorbed catastrophic doses. Then came one of the darkest details in the whole disaster. The Soviets tried using robots to clear radioactive debris from the roof, but unfortunately the robots broke. Radiation had fried them, so they used men instead. These men became known grimly as biorobots. Thousands of them were sent onto the roof in protective gear that was nowhere near enough, given a shovel, told to throw radioactive graphite over the edge, and then run back. Their time on the roof was measured in seconds, not because that was a convenient shift length, because that was about how long the state believed their bodies could be spent there. 40 seconds, 60 seconds, 90 seconds, that was your window. Your lifetime allowance. Imagine climbing onto a roof knowing that the invisible thing around you is so deadly that even the machines were defeated first. And yet, the system still finds a way to say, your turn. The details only get worse. Some of the first responders received doses so high, they died in agony. One wife later described how they had trouble dressing her husband's body for burial because there was, in her words, barely a whole body left to put clothes on. 3 men later entered radioactive water beneath the plant to open drainage valves and help prevent an even larger explosion. For years, popular retellings treated them as instant martyrs. The truth is more complicated, but that almost makes it more disturbing. They were not acting inside a grand cinematic final scene, they were doing a specific technical task inside a reality so insane that nobody around them could be sure which actions meant survival and which meant death. And over all of it hung that classic bureaucratic lie. The numbers on paper said one thing while the human body said another. That is what makes Chernobyl Liquidators so chilling. They were not warriors chasing glory, they were men drafted into a disaster zone where reality itself had become hard to measure and where the government's answer to "the robots are melting" was "send more people." Number 1, Viking Berserker. This one is a little different from the others, because a Berserker was not just a dangerous warrior, a Berserker was in effect a human weapon designed to stop functioning like a normal person. The word itself survives in English, berserk, and that tells you almost everything. These fighters entered battle in a state described as shaking, howling, swelling with rage, biting shields, ignoring pain, and sometimes losing the ability to tell friend from foe. For centuries, people argued about what caused it. Modern theories have pointed to substances like henbane, which could potentially explain the delirium, aggression, pain suppression, and total collapse afterward. Whatever the cause, the result was clear. Berserkers were useful right up until the final moment they weren't. Kings used them as shock troops, put them at the front, let them crash into enemy lines like a living avalanche. In saga literature, they are terrifying. They break shields, they kill children, they murder rivals, they go on frenzied states and then come out of them with energy of a man recovering from a severe illness. One saga describes Egil Skallagrimsson committing murder as a child and growing into exactly the kind of man Viking literature treats as both admirable and alarming. Another tells of his father entering a berserk fury during a game and killing a child. Stories of fighters so unstable that even their own side had reason to fear them. And eventually, that became the problem, because a society can admire violence only up to a point. After that, it becomes a liability. By the 11th century, berserkers had become such a menace that authorities had outlawed them. Think about how insane that is. Their whole culture brand was uncontrollable murder machines, and eventually even Viking society looked at this and said, maybe it's become a little bit too much. They were in a sense workers optimized for a task that destroyed the worker. You could use them, you could fear them, you could tell stories about them for centuries. But you couldn't really build a stable world around them, because once a man's job requires him to annihilate his own self-preservation and maybe his own identity, he stops being a soldier and starts becoming a hazard to everything nearby. Which is why berserkers may be the purest example on this list of a deadly profession consuming the person inside. So what ties all 5 of these jobs together? It's not just that they're dangerous, it's that every one of them depended on some authority figure taking unbearable reality and wrapping it in an acceptable language. Rome had games, plague-ridden cities had doctors, armies had runners, the Soviet Union had liquidators, Norse kings had trusted men. Every civilization has a talent for making a death sentence sound like a role, and again human beings stepped into those roles anyways. Sometimes for money, sometimes for status, sometimes because the alternative was even worse. That might be the darkest part of all. Not that these jobs existed, but that history kept finding ways to fill them.